Hello and welcome to another Register Kettle, your chance to hear about the news from the people who actually write it. Now, we've got a sort of out-of-this-world feeling to this week's show because there's trouble in space. We have Boeing astronauts, or test pilots as they're called, stuck on the ISS because their spacecraft won't work. They're sheltering because of Russian space debris. We've also got a contract from SpaceX to actually destroy the ISS later on in life, and China is eating our lunch. So, Richard, as our UK specialist when it comes to space issues, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, it's been a bit of an interesting week, I think, as far as things in orbit are concerned. We'll start with the Starline. This is Boeing Starline. It's the first crewed mission to the space station. They had two goes before. The first one didn't make it. The second one did make it after some thruster problems. This one arrived at the space station at the start of June. It was only supposed to be there, I think, for just over a week, but it's had its return date postponed over and over and over again. And now it's at some point later in July, might even slip into August. Not quite sure. I think we'll find out more later on tonight, so we need to be careful about making ourselves too much hostage to fortune there.
Well, this is it. There is a press conference scheduled for this afternoon.
That's correct, yeah. I mean, there's been multiple problems. I think we should be clear to say up front that it has been cleared for an emergency return. So if the crew had to come back in a big hurry, they could do. What they're doing now is the engineers on the ground are trying to work out basically what's going on, because they've got multiple helium leaks now. But again, in theory, managers say there's enough helium to get through the mission and then some, so they're okay there. But you need the helium to pressurize the thrusters, but the thrusters also aren't working properly. When it docked to the space station, it docked late because the thrusters stopped working. They brought, I think, 4 or 5 thrusters back online again after adjusting the bounds. So again, they're trying to work out all these things that aren't working quite right, because, of course, when they come back, they have a nominal mission plan that they plan to bring the astronauts back on. And the problem is that it's not nominal anymore. They're going to have to work out a different plan. And the other issue is that they need to ensure that they've investigated as much as they possibly can, because as soon as they start to return to Earth, the service module of the Starline, which is where all these problems are, that's discarded and gets burnt up. So this is the only chance the engineers get to actually look at the real hardware and see what's going on. So hence it's been delayed. But there's a clock ticking. This spacecraft has to come back. I think it's only warranted for 45 days of docked operations with the space station, so it has to come back one way or another. I mean, if it can't come back, and again, as I say, it's been cleared for an emergency return, I mean, then you'd have to have something like a Dragon spacecraft rescue, which would be quite embarrassing, really, for Boeing. And it's just a very strange situation.
Hugely embarrassing.
Well, I mean, when this was announced, oh crikey, it was years and years ago. You had SpaceX and Boeing with the two teams who were providing commercial transport to and from the space station. And what's happened is that back then we thought, well, SpaceX, it's a bit dodgy. Boeing, it's a safe pair of hands. And how things have changed.
If it's not Boeing, we're not going, and now it is Boeing, and we're not going. You know? Well,
exactly. I coined the phrase "calamity capsule" about Starliner, and suddenly that's not seeming very funny anymore.
Not when there's lives on the line this time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, they can stay up. Sorry.
I was going to say, at least the door didn't blow off. Of all the things that could go wrong in orbit, I mean,
all
the parts are still attached.
Yes, having a door blow off in low Earth atmosphere is fine, but doing it at the ISS is kind of more dangerous. But I mean,
exactly.
It's okay. It's not a panic situation because they carry enough food and air up there for 6 months. But at the same time, it's really not a good look. I mean, Richard,
it isn't good at all. I mean,
Boeing was supposed to be. Sorry, go on.
Well, it isn't a good look because, I mean, they need this mission to go well in order to become operational. I mean, NASA's bought a whole bunch of missions with Starliner, but I mean, I can't imagine they're going to launch the next operational mission with a crew on board until they've solved all of these problems. That's going to push it well into 2025 and maybe beyond. And of course, we're going to come up next to the fact that the International Space Station is getting quite close to the end of its life. I mean, it's we're going to discuss next about how it can be deorbited, because it's 400,000 kilograms of stuff. It's a big thing to come down, and it's got to come down. I think 2030 is the end of its life, and it's now 2024, so it's getting a bit tight, really.
But could its life be extended? I mean, I understand, we've got a certain amount of metal fatigue going on. Could extra shielding be put on? It seems a waste to deorbit this kind of heavy mass.
Possibly. There are some elements that could go on beyond 2030. I think the biggest problem is, without wishing to be nationalistic, is the Russian section, because that section is very, very old now. And there have been issues and leaks around the Russian section. So I think that bit would need to come off whatever happens, because there are issues around that. You could potentially extend its life, but it's going to keep failing. This thing was designed, after all, in the 80s and 90s. I mean, it's got its origins in Space Station Alpha, I think. So it's quite an old design. You could potentially send it to a higher orbit where it could be a museum piece or could be used again at some point in the future. The problem with that is it could come to pieces. I mean, there's been an issue this week where a Russian satellite came to pieces, and that meant the International Space Station astronauts had to take refuge or take shelter on board the space station in case any debris struck them. So you've got to be quite careful. So I think the safest approach is going to be probably to destroy it. But, and again, we saw this week, the implications of if things come down in an uncontrolled fashion. There was the issue where a battery pack from the space station re-entered in an uncontrolled fashion in April. That punched a hole through a roof of a person's house in Florida, which is unfortunate. It narrowly missed some occupants, I understand. And
they're now suing, yes.
For liability. So you need to bring this thing down in a controlled fashion and make sure, because let's face it, a thing the mass of the International Space Station, bits of it will survive. And you want to make sure those bits don't come anywhere near any populated areas.
I mean, I can't imagine that SpaceX's design, or whatever it's going to end up looking like, won't include some sort of disassembly in orbit, right? Like, it's going to have to. Like, there's no way you can just shunt that thing toward Earth and be like, Godspeed, Space Lab, again. I feel like there has to be some disassembly, right?
Certainly they're going to have to take it apart, surely, before chucking various different points down into the atmosphere. I'm glad you mentioned Skylab, Brandon. Sorry.
Yeah, Skylab did come down and hit Australia quite hard in the late 70s, and I'm of an age where I remember that happening, and the little hats and things people bought to protect themselves from Skylab.
I just really be quite the show, sitting out in the middle of the Pacific or the Indian Ocean or wherever they decide to deorbit it into, and watch that thing come in. I mean, it'd be one hell of a show.
Quite the fireball, yeah.
And you just know someone's going to be on eBay going, an actual piece of the ISS, which I fished out of the water. Honestly, it's really legit.
Exactly.
But you mentioned, Richard, that they're sheltering from space debris.
Yeah, I mean, as far as it coming apart is concerned, it should come to pieces as it enters. And again, the modules of them themselves, the bolts and things that hold them together, can be remotely activated to separate them, but I would think it will probably come apart. The problem is that there are some very hefty parts that are just going to survive. Bits from the laboratory, bits of metal. You only need to look at what hit that person's house in Florida. In Florida, that was, I think, a securing part from a battery pallet, and so there are some hefty bits of the ISS that even if you dismantle it, they're still going to survive re-entry. So. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was a 5-ton battery pack, which apparently
somewhere safe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, it was apparently a 5-ton battery pack, which they expected to get burnt up by friction, but didn't actually happen. I mean, Brandon and Tobias, as the Americans in the crew, how proud are you of this? I mean, is this going to be a national thing if it comes down and we have no space station anymore?
I mean, it'll probably go commercial, right? That's what I think NASA was kind of leaning on. It was like, oh, we want this to go more commercial, private, small installations, right? Because everyone knows right now the best situation we can do in the orbit is throw up more small objects to bounce around up there, right? Yeah. I mean, like I think, Richard, your story said that Russian satellite that broke into 100 visible pieces, right? But I mean, like we all know, when something breaks up like that, there are tons more pieces that are the size of a grain of sand that can still have a massive impact when they're traveling, tens of thousands of miles an hour or however fast they go in orbit around the planet. I mean, they can punch a hole in the hull or a solar panel, smaller than a grain of rice. I mean, I feel like this is just going to end up being more crowded and more crowded. And to speak to the whole Boeing thing too, beyond ISS, right? Like I've had this kind of concern for a while in the back of my head. Maybe Richard, you can speak a bit more to this since you're more of a space buff than I am, but we're watching Starship go up multiple times, right? And it's gotten better in recent months, right? It's not failing as hard as it did. But, it's so complicated. There are so many engines. There's so much stuff because the space operations we're thinking about now aren't just let's get the smallest amount of stuff up with the lowest amount of thrust possible. It's how can we build a craft big enough to send massive satellites into orbit or get to the Mars or the moon, and so the complexity level of these things is just skyrocketing. And I'm wondering if we're not reaching a point in space exploration where we're butting up against a threshold of excess complexity. Like we can't do much more in orbit because the fail points are so great. There are so many engines, so many Raptors on the Starship, right? That one of them is bound to fail. Like it's just, I'm wondering if we're not reaching a point where we need to start thinking about actually constructing large craft and stuff in orbit and ferrying people to and from the ground that way, to reduce the need for getting out of atmosphere and things like that. I'm really curious about the future in that regard because it seems like complexity is becoming a problem.
I mean, certainly it's the future is interesting. I mean, there has been a trend actually more towards sort of a larger spacecraft launching many, many more smaller satellites. If you can see, if you look at how SpaceX have done Starlink and the Falcon 9, they'll shove up 50 or so in one go. So you'll have a big old rocket launching lots of small things. And that seems to be the trend.
And we had the heavy launch this week as well.
Sorry,
we had the heavy launch this week as well from SpaceX.
We did. Yeah, and again, being a bit of a nerd, while I must admit I'm very affronted by the sheer wastage involved in these things and how much fuel is burnt up and the pollution. I'd love to see a heavy launch.
You and me both. When you see the two boosters come down in sync, it's kind of like Arthur C. Clarke would have loved to have seen this. But
I mean, I think to your point, Brandon, about complexity, I think if we look at what SpaceX are doing in terms of reusability, that I think is kind of more the way that things are going now. Because if you look at Ariane 6, which I think is due to launch on its maiden flight next week, that's fully expendable. And I can remember talking to the ESA DG years ago, and he said we would never do that again now. We'd never build a rocket that's going to be launched once and thrown away. We'd make it reusable over and over and over again. And I think that seems to be the way things are definitely going. So they may be getting more complex, but they're also being more reusable as well. Kind of almost like the dream of the space shuttle, except it's actually working.
Right.
Yeah, and to weigh in on the kind of demise of the ISS, impending or otherwise, we don't know what will ultimately happen, whether it will be saved, but it would be really sad if we didn't have something to replace it. I don't think U.S. politics would allow that to happen. I think the Chinese have been too successful, even with their smaller, space stations. I think that there's enough competitive pressure at the national level that the U.S. will never allow it to be an entirely corporate or commercialized program. However, I would say that it is sort of nice to see us looking at space and going, how big of a problem can we solve again? Because it got really boring after the Apollo program, and then the space shuttle looked promising.
We had the Hubble repair mission, Okay, I mean, we had the Hubble repair mission. I would argue that was actually a pretty damn feat of engineering. But I get what you're saying. But now we're on the race to the moon. But you brought up China, Tobias. It looks like China is eating our breakfast on this. They've just brought back the first moon samples from the far side. And they're showing no signs of slowing down.
Right. And that's without having to send astronauts there to do it, too. So, I mean, there's also a degree of how much of space exploration can you get away with being unmanned. We've been tremendously successful in this regard. While there are certainly things that we won't be able to do unless we send folks up there to go stand on the moon again, maybe Mars in the future, to Brandon's point, the complexity can get in the way of things where, if we try to do too much too quickly, we can find ourselves in a situation where if we had just sent another unmanned probe and thought about how to do a return mission, granted, trying to bring stuff back from Mars is a hard problem no matter what, as Richard has pointed out on numerous occasions. But from the moon, I mean, it's been done, and we have seen just this week with the Chinese that not only can it be done, but it can be done by more than just the nations you might expect.
So, I mean, just a wrap-up question for all of you in terms of this: manned space travel or robot space travel, which is best?
Well,
I'll go first.
practically, I think robots at this point, but I want Star Trek.
Yeah, and also, Ian, I've got to say, I think you mean human spaceflight or crewed spaceflight. We don't say manned anymore.
Fair point. But I mean, it's just.
But I think
go on, please.
You know, as a massive spaceflight nerd, I'd always want to see humans yomping around on the moon's surface or in space or on Mars. That's great. As an engineer and a scientist, I mean, robots are so much more efficient. You can launch, for the sheer amount of complexity and plumbing you've got to use to get meat bags into orbit, you could send up, as Tobias says, dozens of robots that could probably do as good a job, if not better. And in terms of inspiring people, I would just say the word Voyager. You know, those two robots have been going for 50 years and they are very inspirational. They've done some incredible science. So, yeah, I'd say...
And the ultimate amount of remote tech support as well.
Yeah, and then don't get me wrong. I think that human space travel will stick around for a long time. I think that the communications delays, the farther we go out, and the kind of decision making that we're going to be needing to make is going to be far beyond the capacities of any AI that is also, space rated. Because, as fast as a GPU is, bit flips are going to be a real big problem. And how reliable is that going to be? I mean, there's a reason that we keep sending up CPUs from the 90s that have been radiation hardwired, because when the processing is that physically large, it's not as problematic as when you have something where the transistors are, nanometers across. So I still think that we're going to need humans up there. And to Brandon's point, I do want Star Trek.
Don't we all?
You just got to figure out subspace communications, and that whole problem will be solved.
The old Ansible machine would be nice, but it's I don't know. I'm a Trekkie as well, as opposed to Star Wars, but it's going to be a while. In the meantime, though, we shall keep an eye on things. Look to the skies, as the phrase goes, and we shall see how it turns out. But thank you very much, and thank you, Richard, for joining us from the UK. And we'll be back for another kettle next week.